Hello and welcome to the Screencast on Americas in the Age of Independence, Chapter 30 in Bentley and Ziegler's Traditions and Encounters, 5th edition. This chapter carries on from parts of Chapter 28, which looked at some of the revolutions that created independent states in the Americas. I'll move myself above this railroad scene. This chapter will cover North and South America during the time period roughly from the earliest 1800s all the way through just past the 1900s, to be honest. And students of American or Canadian history will find some examples that are familiar to them from those classes. What I would encourage you to do is to look at those and just see how they look from a different angle, a world history perspective. So here, this image, which starts chapter 30, shows Chinese migrants engaged in railroad labor in the United States. And this also would have happened as part of the Canadian Pacific Railway in Canada. And in American and Canadian history, this is a tale of migration and industrialization, immigration, and that's true. But of course, from a world perspective, we're going to be also interested in the flow of people across the Pacific and the various forms that would take in terms of free laborers, contract laborers. That's two examples. So that's just one way we can take a look at things we already know and see how they fit into the current unit. All right, if we come on down here then. So this is the connection I was mentioning to Chapter 28, the establishment of new nations. This map here shows the Latin American nations. Although, as is often the case with the representation of Latin America in world history books, there's something a little funny about it. Because the map shows Mexico, it says 1821 for independence, but it shows the 1849 borders of Mexico. Meanwhile, we see the Republic of Colombia, which is sort of the united country that's today Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, that has the borders there, as they would have existed in 1819 through 1830. So this is one of the maps that you should take figuratively and not literally, right? Meaning you want to look at the different parts of it and see what it represents. But it shows you these new countries that gained independence in the early 1800s. At this point in time, through especially 1867, Canada was a part of the British Empire and remained so, but Canadians who were of European ancestry were divided by language between English and French speakers, but together Euro-Canadians were established some degree of home rule in the the last third of the 19th century. So these are the countries we're looking at here in this unit. So let's take a look at the themes then that develop. Okay. One of the main themes in this whole period, or the number one key concept in this whole period, is industrialization. Now, the image we see here is from the end of the time period. This might even be just the other side of 1900 into the 1900s. This section will really put the circa in circa 1900. So just be aware that a lot of the developments that we associate with the 1800s really are post-1900 developments as well. So industrialization will have different effects on different countries in the Americas and different effects on different regions within the countries in the Americas. For Latin Americans, their economy's tradition of commodity exporting, which has been going on from early colonial times, with sugarcane the most commonly cited product in a world history class from the previous time period. Well, that will continue, except now there'll be new commodities that are part of industrialization, such as copper. Both Mexico and Chile have deposits of copper that were part of the that were used in industrial processes, electricity, wiring, those kinds of things. This, though, dependence on exports of primary goods creates difficulties for governments, even if they're independent and not colonies, because the fluctuations in prices mean that it's difficult to purchase, build infrastructure on credit like most countries do, because it's difficult to service that debt when the taxes on those exports are going up and down with the prices. So meaning government revenue is not stable because the prices of things like copper or off the coast of Peru, guano, they they bounce around so much that if a country's too dependent on one or two goods being exported, it creates difficulties that way. The other thing to know is even though there were some elite Latin Americans who would have benefited from the investments in commodity extraction. That's really what we're talking about, is extracting commodities out of Latin America. The profits mainly are going to accrue outside of the country. So in terms of how capitalism works, the capitalism all staying in the country to be reinvested. Now later, when we look in chapter 32, we'll start talking about this as economic imperialism, which means that the imperialist, the more powerful, in this case, business representing a more powerful country, is able to profit from the resources in another country without formally taking over its government. So this is going to cut a few ways. Now, some people in places like Mexico, this mine will probably employ some Mexican clerks. There might be some elite Mexicans who invested in it. So it's like not like everybody suffers as a result of it. But you really need to pay attention to how industrialization affects different places in different ways. In the US and Canada, there are areas of industrialization itself, meaning not just extracting the commodities necessary for industrialization. Here we see one effect of that, railroad building. But so there are factories that are producing goods in both of those places. In general, that's not happening in Latin America, and their economies remain more dependent on commodity export. It's also true, by the way, in parts of the US and Canada. So again, there's going to be areas in Latin America where there is some industrial development, although not much, meaning like factories producing finished goods. But it's also true that there are sections of the United States that are in Canada that are primarily producing primary goods in ways that leave them vulnerable to the market in the same way. Oop, backwards. I don't know what that's about. Okay, here we are. This is a vintage map. There wasn't a map showing this in Bentley and Ziegler's chapter 30, so I went to the Library of Congress and located this for all of you. So the subheading here underneath imperialism and nation state formation is about regional warfare and diplomacy. So the book goes through a couple of examples about that. One is the War of 1812, which is between the British Empire and the United States, but in some ways it's between the US and Canada. The recent events in our nation's capital, I'm recording this in January of I'm an American. I'm recording this in January of 2021. It was the first time that a government building like that was occupied by hostile forces since the War of 1812, when Canadians famously burned the White House. So there's that. So the War of 1812, though, is kind of a war between the U.S. and Canada, and it essentially ends in a draw, which leaves the kind of which means that the United States survives as an independent entity. That's really what's important, and doesn't expand into Canada. So then from that point on, we should see the United States as an imperialist country as well, and also Canada as imperialist, part of the British Empire, or as a self-governing territory. What we see here is the map that was used at the end of the Mexican-American War, so bringing in the third large North American country, Mexico, where the United States, amidst considerable domestic debate in the U.S. about the war, some really famous Americans, like Abraham Lincoln, opposed the U.S.-Mexico War in 1846. But the war went ahead, and the United States annexed a lot of territory. And this was the map of the U.S. that was used, with some new states there, new at the time, that was used at the treaty negotiations. So you want to kind of pay attention to that. So modern empire building as the United States expanded west. This empire building will engender resistance. And again, this is a topic that will come up more in chapter 32, or come up again in chapter 32, where we see people resisting the so-called new imperialism of the late 1800s, when European countries and the United States took over territories overseas. But I think it's useful to see and for American and Canadian students to understand the resistance of Indigenous peoples, both direct resistance, like Sitting Bull, who organized military forces that won a famous victory over American U.S. military forces, or cultural resistance, like the Ghost Dance, as types of resistance to imperialism. These are called out in the AP World Course and Exam description as illustrating examples, meaning you don't have to know about them, but you can use them as examples. I think it's interesting also to notice the original caption to this picture, which calls Sitting Bull the head chief at the Custer massacre. I think we probably see that in a more balanced or even the opposite way today. Custer was incurring into indigenous territory. So there's that. Just keep these kind of perspective sourcing things in mind as we take a look at what's happening. Meanwhile, there's similar things happening in Canada. So you can see here is Louis Riel, who's a Canadian resistor who would have been viewed as a rebel in his own time by most Canadians, like white Canadians, but today is considered one of the Canadian national heroes by a lot of people. So he was of Métis, it's Metis, Métis heritage, which means mixed. So similar to the mestizo, term used in Latin America. And there were a lot of people in this category who identified as both native and European, often with French names descended from French traders and indigenous women. And so he led an uprising in Manitoba, and you can see the railroad going through there, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, as an example of imperial expansion, and then the settlement along that railroad that then prompted resistance from Native and Métis peoples. So it's another example that you can use for imperial resistance. This chapter is also going to discuss a few instances of rebellion against existing governments. So this is like internal resistance or rebellion, slightly different than resisting imperialism, although, of course, there will be some overlap. So in this image here, we see Emiliano Zapata, who died in 1919 and is part of the Mexican Revolution that is often identified as 1910 to 1920, but really continued through the whole 20s. It is a very complex event. And in some ways, it's misplaced here because it's very much part of the 20th century and would be usefully compared with the Russian revolutions that happened in the first 2 decades of the 20th century and the Chinese Revolution of 1911 that overthrew the dynasty system. But you can take a look at it here. Nothing wrong with that. It does show us a mass movement of people, like a popular revolution against inequality, and Zapata is definitely a figure, kind of a figurehead, but a leading example of that. Somebody who's still famous today. I mean, with the hat and the mustache and the outfit, it's really difficult not to see why that is the case. So we have Emiliano Zapata. But the Mexican Revolution itself was extremely complex and involved lots of different revolutionary armies led by different charismatic generals that fought in different parts of the country over more than a decade. So the thing that I would tell students is you need to keep the Mexican Revolution straight from the Mexican War of Independence that happened 100 years earlier when Mexico became an independent country. So this Mexican Revolution is a different event 100 years later. You don't need to keep track of all the different characters in that because there's a lot. That would be the subject for a Mexican history class. But it is useful to know that you have different revolutionary armies and that many regular people were motivated because they were trying to change their material situation. But there was a lot more going on than that. The U.S. Civil War is also a part of this. And so, again, things that students already know about the U.S. Civil War are things that can be incorporated into a world history class. So you kind of want to look for how you can do that. That will be similar with our last slide here, which is on global migration, which is the fourth key concept in the modern period, 1750 to 1900. So lots more migrants. And again, students of American or Canadian history will be familiar with those stories, especially European migrants coming into the East Coast and Asian migrants coming into the West Coast. So that's good. Again, you can use that information. Millions of people left Europe during the period from like 1820 to World War One. So about 1820, like 1914, millions, and about half those people wound up coming to the United States. But the other half cross the Atlantic and are going to wind up in other countries. And there's the ABC countries here, a little mnemonic device for you. So this picture shows Argentina, where our Italian migrants came in very large numbers, many of whom stayed just for a time and went back or migrated seasonally. You have like farm workers by this time using the steamships to migrate across the Atlantic Ocean seasonally. So some real, one of the reasons more people come is the boats are bigger. Simple. And steam power means they can move faster. But millions stayed also in Argentina, very much a receiving country for migrants. Also, I got this picture from a website about the tango. So there's African rhythms from the port of Buenos Aires that are embedded in local music, for centuries. And then some of that combined with some Italian instrumentation and dance moves. And there's a whole history there of the tango. So if you're interested in checking some out, I can recommend the classic tracks of Astor Piazzolla. So again, you got an Italian name there from Argentina. It's hot stuff. Okay. Most of these migrants who are coming are economic in one way or another, coming to settle or coming to work temporarily. And in some cases, you can pay attention to this, it's also going to involve the Pacific. So it's a different, into like places like Hawaii. There are indentured laborers from Japan and China, and I should have added India there. I missed that, going to the British colony. So after the abolition of slavery, there are indentured laborers coming to work in these plantation economies. So Havana, Cuba, it's got a Chinatown. There's a lot of really great South Asian Indian derived food in the country Trinidad, which is a big island off the coast of South America. So some more stuff to check out. Okay, so that is the deal. So we see all four themes or key concepts in this time period. So take a look for them and take the history you already know and apply it to the key concepts in world history. All right, thanks.